Welcome everybody who's joining us from here in Connecticut and around the country. We are so lucky to have our special guest with us today, Richard Fontaine. Richard is the CEO of the Center for New American Security. Prior to being at CNAS, he was a foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain and worked with the State Department, the National Security Council, and on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Welcome today, Richard.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here virtually if I can't be in Connecticut in person. So I appreciate the opportunity.
So as we sit here today, you're joining us virtually because all of us are in lockdown because of the coronavirus. So if we look at what's happened over the last few months, we know that in late 2019, this virus started in Wuhan, China. And then as we sit here today, it's impacted over 177 countries, billions of people in quarantine. The U.S. is, has the highest number of confirmed cases, followed by Spain and Italy and Germany. Can you talk to us? Can you set the stage a little bit about what are some of the priorities that you're working on?
Well, a lot of it, as you would imagine, is trying to make sense of this new world we're in and the geopolitical ramifications of what is, God willing, a once in a century kind of pandemic that we won't see again in our lifetimes. And if you step back and look at just how much has changed over the past few weeks, it's really every aspect of our national security and foreign policy priorities. U.S. China relations, which we'll talk about today, has certainly changed and gotten even more strained because of the coronavirus and the accusations flying back and forth and Chinese behavior and so forth. But for example, American troops in Iraq are hunkering down, as you would expect, to try to prevent the spread of coronavirus, and ISIS has said that it'd like to take advantage of that. Whether it can, who knows? The amazing intervention by the government in the markets and in the economy takes us into a very different place with ramifications down the line. Iran sanctions. You can sort of go around the world and around the issues, and there's a lot of implications we're trying to make sense of. And then, stepping back even further, globalization as a phenomenon by some metrics was already in something of a decline over the past 10 years with its peak around the global financial crisis. And this will put different kinds of pressure, and I think end up in a different form of globalization than we had until this point. And that's a major opportunity for the United States to think about what is the world to come that emerges from all this, and how do we best remain assertive in trying to establish something better to follow.
Thank you. So can you, let's talk about China and the U.S. How has the coronavirus become another battleground for the great power competition between the United States and China?
Well, the great power competition framework has been, I think, pretty well established, certainly between the United States and China over the past few years. As the United States has shifted its focus more to the Indo-Pacific, as China has grown in strength, grown in assertiveness under Xi Jinping and so forth. That said, even the most claw-bearing China hawks in Washington generally would exclude from that competition areas where the United States and China could, at least theoretically, work together. The cooperative areas on transnational issues that really need the United States and China to come together against shared threats. So you can, the paradigmatic example was always climate change. We should be doing something together on climate change as a shared threat. No one has an interest in climate change occurring. Proliferation, same thing. And global health. No one has an interest in a pandemic disease spreading. It obviously poses extreme dangers on the health and on the economic side and all of this. So you would think, given that the United States and China might actually come together in common cause to beat back the coronavirus. But in fact, most of what you've seen so far has been completely the opposite. This has emerged as one more vector of competition between the United States and China rather than an island of cooperation in a sea of competition. So from the very beginning, China of course, covered up the extent of the infections in Wuhan province. But it also blamed the United States for fear mongering and said the United States was not helping itself enough, tried to kind of deflect blame at home onto the foreign entity there. Then China has tried to impose this narrative, including the foreign ministry spokesman for quite a while saying that, well, maybe this wasn't a Chinese virus that went to America, but an American virus that came to China, which of course is an outrageous sort of thing to say. They've backed off of that. But they're trying to kind of recast the narrative as, look at the strength of our efficient autocracy that can build a hospital in a few days and come to the aid of other countries like Spain and Italy and Europe and other things, while the United States is befuddled and internally focused and not leading and things like that. The Trump administration's initial response was basically to call it the China virus over and over again, which doesn't accomplish a whole lot. And there's been a tiny détente since a phone call between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump a few days ago. But the big picture here is that this, unfortunately, I think, is emerged as one more avenue for competition rather than as a commons for cooperation.
So let's talk a little bit about China and how it's exerting global leadership during this pandemic, and what role China is currently playing on the global stage. So we know, as the U.S. is sort of really in the thick of the virus, China's emerging as this leader.
Well, it's trying to emerge as a leader. There are real limits to what it can do and what it is doing. It's mostly emerging as a leader in the provision of medical supplies directly to countries that are in need. So while the United States, quite understandably, is scouring the earth to try to find ways to fill the gap that we have in ventilators and respirators and other medical equipment and supplies, China, which is well post-peak in terms of its own infections, is taking some of its stock and landing very conspicuous planes carrying aid to Spain and Italy and other European countries. The Jack Ma Foundation has now touted that it has delivered equipment and supplies to all 54 African countries, for example, and things like that. And there's the not so subtle contrast that they will draw between the United States, that's looking abroad to bring equipment here, and China, which is taking equipment from home and spreading it to other countries. Of course, China was not doing that at the height of its own epidemic. It was doing quite the opposite, but that's what it's doing now. That said, what you don't see out of China is any sort of international coalition building. They're providing supplies, but the G20 has not come together in common cause. Usually that would have to be an American-led thing. In the absence of America, China is either unable or unwilling to fill that role. And I think, certainly countries will be grateful for any, as New York State was, for any Chinese provisions that are made available. But I do think it's going to be an uphill climb for them to really change the narrative, because people are following this so closely. They know where the virus began. They have a general sense that had the world had better information earlier, it could have gotten a better handle on this. And so we'll have to see how all of this nets out in terms of whether China marks this up as a win or not.
Thank you. So I'm going to bring in an audience question. And so someone wanted to know, given the history of censorship and suppression in China, how much should we trust the China's government's claims regarding the taming of the COVID-19 in China?
I don't think you can trust the specific numbers. There are other pieces of evidence you might look to get a sense of the direction. So, for example, they've reopened a lot of public places, and life is starting to get back to something approaching normal in Wuhan province and things. Those are indicators that the epidemic is not as in its acute phase there. But that said, it's very hard to put any stock in the actual numbers of reported cases. And so I think the reality is we just don't know how many infections there are in China, or even how many deaths have been associated with COVID.
So would you agree with the Trump administration's assessment as China being the #1 long-term threat to U.S. national security?
Yeah, I would. I mean, there's different ways of thinking about, long-term threat. When you start thinking about the possibilities of global warming, that sort of, crowds out the ability to think about other threats, things like that. But if we're talking about nation state related threats to the United States, China is the long-term threat and the long-term challenger, not because we believe that China is going to launch an invasion of the United States, but rather it's more able to shape a world that is conducive to its particular brand of illiberal autocracy, which is a model very different and in some ways antithetical to the model that we enjoy here at home. And so, the reach of China, whether it comes from its economic reach, its ability to set standards and norms around the world, its ability to have the kind of technological sweep that it would like to see, and things like that, threaten the kind of way of life at home and for our friends and allies abroad that, of course, we Americans think is so important. And so it's a bit more amorphous of a threat than we sometimes think about it, because we kind of think about sometimes we think about China as either a conquering nation or not, and to me that's too simple. It's about this way of life that we would like to enjoy indefinitely that is going to be increasingly under pressure if we don't compete effectively with China.
So, to that point, when we're talking about today, is the U.S. showing any global leadership at this time? What should the U.S. be doing in order to sort of rise to the challenge posed by China?
Well, if you take the coronavirus thing as today's example, you really don't see much global leadership, including in the key multilateral bodies, the G7, the G20, the UN Security Council. All of there's been a few statements here and there that those have put out pledging all sorts of abstract cooperation, but there hasn't been a single specific and time-bound commitment that's emerged from any of that. The UN Security Council can't even get its act together to issue a statement, which is fairly sad. But a lot of times these kinds of things are dismissed as talk shops and just kind of global-only types of things. But in fact, if you look at the history of this, the Bush administration post 9/11 was able to use multilateral fora like the G8 back then, before Russia was tossed out, APEC and things like that, to get commitments on reinforced cockpit doors and passenger manifests and some very specific things related to security that we're living with even today. Certainly, they were able to use those bodies to put together billions and billions of dollars of money for AIDS treatment that have saved millions of lives. In the G20 was a key steering mechanism after the global financial crisis, where they agreed on $4 trillion in global stimulus, things like that. But what it required in all those cases is not leaders sitting around the table and somebody having a good idea and everybody saying, yeah, that sounds great, let's sign up to it, but rather the United States coming in with a very specific agenda of what it thought was the right thing to do, and then bringing other countries aboard onto that agenda. And in the absence of that, the stark reality is the rest of the world, or the rest of the G7 or the G20 or the UN Security, they just do not self-organize. They don't fill in the gap left by American leadership in those institutions. And so what you see is what you see right now, which is really very little in terms of international cooperation.
So if we're talking about sort of multilateral organizations, international organizations, we have an audience question about what's going on with the WHO. And we saw that, the WHO has been accused of being way too close with China. We know that there's some controversy in that they're not recognizing, Taiwan in their response to COVID. And then we heard what the Trump administration said yesterday. Can you talk a little bit about the role of that international organization?
Sure. The WHO has been quite peculiarly uncritical of China from the very beginning of this pandemic. And then you couple that with the fact that Taiwan has not been able to be a member of the WHO, and its disposition, both overly favorable toward China and keeping Taiwan at arm's length, which, by the way, has done a truly excellent job at stopping the coronavirus in its own country. It's pretty outrageous. It really is pretty outrageous behavior. That said, there's only one WHO. There's only one organization, for example, right now, that is trying to marshal the resources for an emergency response fund that could make health resources available to countries that completely lack them. Example of this is the foreign minister of Burkina Faso was asked how it was possible that Burkina Faso has emerged as the only country in Africa with zero coronavirus infections. He said, because we don't have any tests. I mean, it's very obvious about that. So that's a place where an organization like the WHO comes in. The WHO has requested $675 million in emergency spending. The United States has kicked in a significant portion. China has as well, but it's still not totally full. My and everyone else's frustrations with the WHO and the way they've dealt with China and Taiwan are pretty acute. But that said, in the middle of a pandemic, it's not great. It's not a great response to defund the organization that essentially is going to be, for most parts, a pass-through of resources to countries that need them.
Thanks, Richard. So just a few weeks ago, we spoke with David Sanger, who recently was writing about the global competition to develop a vaccine. Is this an element in U.S. China competition? Though the pandemic, doesn't know any national bounds, what does it mean to be the first to develop a vaccine? And then as a follow-up, are you seeing any other global innovation in response to this pandemic?
Yeah, it's not only the United States and China that are competing to develop a vaccine, it's also Europe. And so all three entities are moving as fast as they can, mostly without any cooperation with each other. In a perfect world, which of course we don't live in, they could come together and share information and data and approaches and things like that and try to come up with something together. But that seems, at least as of to this point, not to be the case. So here's where the second order choice may actually not be so bad. If China and the United States and Europe are all racing and spurring each other on to be the first to develop a vaccine, you may get a more decent outcome than if they weren't competing to do that. The key thing will be who gets to do what with the vaccine. If China gets the vaccine first, is it only for the Chinese or is it for the world? Same with the United States, same with Europe. And today, there's no clear answer to that. I mean, there were reports and a lot of suspicions before of these kind of sicken thy neighbor kinds of approaches, where the United States government was going to buy a German medical research company because it thought it might develop a vaccine first, and we wanted to have it for ourselves and things like that. The obvious answer here would be whoever gets to the finish line first shares that model with the rest of the world, and everyone else can march out. I mean, this is a global problem, but I suppose we'll have to cross that bridge when we get closer to it.
So how do you think this escalating competition will impact cooperation in other areas, as you mentioned, like climate change, non-proliferation? Do you think the COVID pandemic is going to alter those kinds of relationships or that kind of collaboration?
Yeah, there's kind of two schools of thought on this, and I'm not totally sure which one is right. One is that, I guess I would say no one thinks that this competition makes cooperation in those areas more likely. The question is, how much less likely does it make it? And of course, one school of thought is, look, this shows just how hard it is to cooperate on anything. I mean, for God's sakes, if the United States can't and China can't cooperate on pandemic disease, how do you think we're going to get our act together and work with the Chinese, or they're going to work in good faith with us on anything else, including global warming, where we have very different views, at least right now, including proliferation, including whatever other transnational issue you might dream of. So that's kind of one. The other is that there's a distinction to be appreciated between issues that resonate at home in China and other ones. So, proliferation issues don't resonate at home in China. This is the province of experts who, deal with these issues. And maybe there is scope for cooperation kind of at the expert to expert level between the United States and China. That's very different than coronavirus, where, the popular discontent with the outbreak was so fierce that China felt like it had to push that criticism in some direction other than the Chinese Communist Party. And guess who got to be, the winner of that? Well, it's the United States. So if you have some issue that has a domestic resonance that becomes domestically political in China, then it makes it very hard to to cooperate. And maybe you could see even a faint analog in the United States with, these repeated attempts to say, well, this is a Chinese virus. Don't blame me for any, any mistakes that you might think the U.S. government had made. Whereas, other issues, proliferation, maybe global warming, don't have such political domestic resonance that they can actually be treated in a more cooperative fashion. I'm not totally sure which one of those is right, but at least I would like to preserve some hope that there remain areas where the United States and China could cooperate, because I expect us to be competitive across 95% of the board.
So I have a question from the audience about, yes, we're talking about competition and a threat from China, but while that's happening, do you believe that we are left open to other kinds of threats? Someone very specifically wants to know, should we be very concerned right now about threats from Russia?
Yeah, this is a great question, because American foreign policy, for those who pay attention to this kind of stuff, has this tendency to lurch from issue to issue after some catalytic event or some dawning realization, and then decide that everything we've been doing up until that time was folly, and that we've lost time, and we have to triple down on whatever the new thing is. So of course, after 9/11, suddenly we said, oh my God, we were focused on things like, China and other things. We need to focus on terrorism. We have a global war on terrorism. It's terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. And of course, terrorism was the number one threat in my mind to the United States at the time, but it wasn't the only threat. It wasn't the only issue, but it really did crowd out a lot of other issues at the time. And then a few years ago, suddenly everybody said terrorism and wars in the Middle East. What have we been wasting our time? We made much too big a deal over the threat posed by terrorists. This is all about great power competition. It's all about China and Russia. So, let's get out of the Middle East, and let's get out of Afghanistan, and let's forget about terrorism to the greatest extent possible, so we can focus on China and maybe a little bit on Russia. And now, and maybe you'll see something with pandemic. People say, well, China, Russia, who really cares about the South China Sea or One Belt, One Road? This is about, fighting back pandemic disease that can destroy our economy and our way of life. And the point is not that these things are not important. It's just that they're not the only issue. And by overreacting in one direction, you underreact in others. And so it is true, I think, that China is the number one long-term threat to the United States. But I think it's also true that in the short run, the number one short-run nation-state threat to the United States is Russia. And that's because of its willingness and capability to disrupt our democracy, which it shows on a daily basis by meddling in our elections, trying to sow disinformation, trying to pit each other, at each other's throats and things like that. That's a direct threat to the United States. And of course, then there's all these other issues. Now add pandemic to the plate. And it's hard to deal with multiple issues at the same time, but the United States is not a regional power. It has global interests. We have values that we feel very strongly about, and we have to be able to deal with multiple issues at the same time.
So we have a question from one of our World Affairs Council colleagues. Is there any info coming from within China about how the Chinese population has reacted to its government's response around COVID, or are we not seeing any sort of pressure building?
Episodic. There have been a number of essays and articles written that express deep dissatisfaction with the Communist Party that immediately were taken down, or in a couple of cases, the authors have disappeared. So there's evidence here and there of, some real discontent with the way the government has handled the matter. But it's hard to tell how representative that is compared to all of the allowable rhetoric and publications saying, we whipped this thing, now we're in a global leadership position. This shows the effectiveness of our particularly ruthless brand of autocracy that can, shut cities down and build hospitals immediately and things like that. It's just very hard to tell. My overall sense is there's certainly disquiet beneath the surface, but how widespread that is, I think, is difficult to determine.
So I have a question from the audience about our manufacturing reliance on China, and how do you think that this pandemic is going to impact, our domestic manufacturing base and our interdependence on China?
Yeah, this is a good question that a lot of people are really thinking about now. And, I think there's a bit of a misconception that the answer to uh, manufacturing reliance on China, which is subject to risks, including pandemic risks, that the answer to that is to reshore that manufacturing in the United States. Um, it's not clear that that's the answer at all. So, for example, there are multiple risks with having supply manufactured in China as a sole source in a particular supply chain. But let's say you're focused on pandemic risk. If you had moved your factory in Wuhan, China, to New Rochelle, New York, you would still be in a world of hurt, because the pandemic would have disrupted the ability of manufacturing to continue in both of those places. The issue on something like pandemic is not that it happens to be in China. The issue is that it happens to be in one place, and that you have a single source of supply rather than a geographically distributed set of suppliers. In order to do that, you increase your cost. You reduce your risk, but you increase your cost. There's economic reasons why that hasn't happened, and I think companies now are going to think harder about whether to absorb more on the cost side and build bigger inventories and things like that, which would increase costs, but buy down risk that supply interruptions would happen. Specific to China, you have other risks, theft of intellectual property, forced into various kinds of partnerships and things like that, political risk essentially, that you would have in China that you wouldn't have in other countries. And I think that's going to be part of the conversation as well. So what I think is likely to emerge from all this is more geographically distributed supply chains, maybe ones that are regionally closer to the United States. You may see some reshoring of manufacturing onto the United States, but I would not look for some tidal wave of factories closing up shop in China and moving to the Rust Belt in the United States.
So, as all of us hopefully soon will emerge from this COVID crisis, how do you see the state of global leadership? Will things have changed, altered? What's the future look like?
Well, part of this is going to will depend on political choices we make here. We got, you may be dimly aware we have an election coming up this year. So a second Trump administration may or may not look very different than the first Trump administration term. A Biden term would almost certainly look quite different than a Trump administration. And so at least the efforts will be different. One thing that I think the coronavirus is demonstrating is there really isn't anyone to fill the gap when the United States chooses not to lead in the world. Whether, and when I say lead, it's not just paying for everything and doing everything that others should be doing. It's setting the agenda, laying out a vision, and then using diplomacy to bring others along that vision and to spend their resources and time and everything and energies toward attaining it. It's an organizational kind of leadership, whether it's among like-minded countries or some body or a larger group or whatever it is. For all China's, throwing medical supplies around the world, China cannot play that role, at least right now. Emmanuel Macron would probably love for Europe to play that role, but Europe can't play that role right now. It's having enough trouble keeping the EU together at this minute. And so what you get really is either some form of American leadership or none. You don't really exchange American leadership for European or Chinese or Russian or anything like that. And that's kind of what we're looking at right now in this particular set of issues. Right now, the United States is internally focused because we're going through one of the most traumatic experiences in the nation's history. As we pull out of this, there will be the opportunity for the United States to grow stronger and fashion something better out of the national trauma. That's a huge opportunity that doesn't come around very often. Whether Trump 2 or Biden 1 will seize it, I don't know, but that opportunity will be there.
So Richard, as we close, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about what some of your other priorities at CNAS are right now. So as we're sort of hyper-focused on what's happening to all of us in quarantine now, what are some of the bigger global issues that are priorities for you that we all need to know about?
Well, at CNAS, we have 7 research programs in 3 large areas. One is geographic. So we have programs in Europe, transatlantic security, in Asia, and in the Middle East. And the Middle East, everything that was going on a few weeks ago in the Middle East is still going on. Israel, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, all of those things are still going on and still important. European security and transatlantic relations continue to be important issues, and so we work on those. Obviously, we just were talking about Asia, but Asia is more than China. It's also our relationship with Japan. North Korea is still out there. They will remind us soon that they are still out there by launching another missile. And then you get into the functional issues. So we have one tier of defense programs on veterans issues, and defense policy looks at the future of warfare and things like that. And then a program on economics and security, and another one on technology and security. So all of those issues still are just as important as they were a few weeks ago. This is really the challenge, that you add pandemic onto that, and then you inject the effect of pandemic into each of those issues. And you have to think about what's different now than it was a couple of months ago. And then bigger picture, one of the things that's, we want to do at CNAS is think about, what does this world look like after we emerge from this global trauma? We have not ever experienced a world where literally billions of people are staying in their houses every day, where we've seen the rapidity of declines in the markets and rise in unemployment and economic shifts that we've seen. It's hard to say exactly what's going to come out of this, but there is this opportunity for the United States to try to shape what's better, what comes out in a way that's better than what went in, but you got to put some specifics behind that, and that's one of the things we hope to do.
Thank you so much for joining us. And we have a ton of questions from the audience, so we're just going to have you back at some point.
All right, thanks.
Hopefully in person. So I hope your family stays safe and well, and I hope everyone out there stays safe and well, and join us next time. Thanks again, Richard.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.